What's going on, everybody? So I have a sweet one for you all today. This is something that I've been working on for the last couple of weeks. I love the dual colored cards, or I should say the mono colored cards with two pips. They're super fun, and I have built one around Tarkin today using command. Before we dive into that, I just want to say a big thank you to everyone who's been checking out the videos and leaving comment suggestions, their thoughts, and overall just the discussion that's been happening. It's been absolutely amazing to see all of you. And again, just a big thank you. If you are interested in additional deck techs that I've been putting out, I have a chart list in the making. I'm just kind of wrapping up. I've been tuning it over the past few days. I kind of just been tuning a bunch of different decks over the past, well, couple of weeks, as well as a yellow Leia, which is a little bit of a variation on the red Leia that I put out a couple of days ago. So subscribe if you don't want to miss those. But onto the sweetness that is this mono green Tarkin list. Now, I truly believe that Red Leia is one of the most powerful decks in the format, and I also think Grand Inquisitor has a really good matchup against the aggro decks. This one's a little bit of an unknown quantity. I've played against a ton of Boba because this is kind of something that, well, in traditional card games, one of the big things that you can do to beat sort of, well, a more tempo-y deck or mid-rangey deck, if you are fighting that type of deck, is to go slightly bigger than them, and that is what this deck is attempting to do. You know, Boba and those types of green Boba decks specifically are running, you know, your resupplies, your super lasers, but their goal is to leverage their additional resources in the early game. Our goal here is to take those early resources, put them into more resources, and then leverage those more resources to just outpower our opponents. It has not worked every time by any means, but I found it to be pretty reasonable, and it's a different spin on things if you want to try it out. With that said, let's start off with the leader and dive into everything that we got going on over here. By the way, I just want to say, some people commenting about the hyperspace versions and the showcase versions that I use. Guys, this is just like the peak card. So I appreciate everyone, you know, kind of noticing that, because I took an extra effort to go ahead and find all the hyperspace versions of every single card because I absolutely love them way more than the normal versions. Anyways, let's talk about Tarkin. Why are we using Tarkin over something like Palpatine? Well, the problem with Palpatine, I think, is he's too expensive. Right? I've tried Palpatine, and oftentimes what ends up happening is he is powerful when he comes down, but I oftentimes want something a little bit earlier to give me a little bit more value, and Tarkin comes in handy, especially since we can leverage some other kind of mini combos inside of the deck. Add to that, we are going to be having a lot of extra resources. Let's say you want to go, let's say, turn 2 resupply or super laser into turn 3 command, which is something that this deck does very frequently. Well, you're going to have an extra resource left over, which you can use it to then give an experience token and then ready up Tarkin to give it another experience token. It can actually be very powerful. And while we are kind of ramping with 9 different ramp spells in this deck, we really do want to leverage our early game plays and make them a lot better with this action from Tarkin, because almost every single one of our units is going to be an Imperial, so we can give those experience counters out very frequently. The backside of Tarkin is, well, very tanky. He's a 2/7, so he's not really great on offense, but the idea behind him is that you can kind of pick off some of the other mediocre units out on the battlefield, or you can just attack base and start spreading around experience counters to some of your more weaker, or let's say more average units. You know, things like Colonel Yularen or even a super laser can start to trade up into the 3 toughness units, which can be quite interesting. So that's why we're using Tarkin over Palpatine. Palpatine's action is just really mediocre. When you're trying to ramp, you really don't want to be defeating your own units. While Palpatine is a bigger payoff and a better payoff if you do get there, you won't get there as frequently as, well, leveraging the experience tokens from Tarkin, as far as I've found. Our base is ECL. This is the best base in the game by a large margin. Any deck that can run ECL is going to be happy, and, well, that is one of the perks of playing mono green. There are really 2 perks in this deck, and ECL is one of them. Because Tarkin doesn't normally get to use ECL, this is something that can really start to power out some plays that honestly might not be typical for a Tarkin deck. Now, which ones are you going to want to be playing with ECL? Well, we'll get to that in just a moment, but some really nice suggestions are things like Steadfast Battalion, Rook is another really good one. Heck, even Super Laser Technician is a very good one, but we'll talk about that more in a bit. With that said, let's talk about our ground units, which make up the vast majority of the deck. So one of the biggest upsides about being mono green is that we get to leverage extremely powerful spells, and we get to play ECL, which works really well with a lot of our creatures, which we'll talk about in just a moment. One of the biggest downsides is that we're limited to one color. However, because green is the deepest color, in my opinion, you're going to find that you really aren't playing any bad cards in the deck. And we're going to talk about all of them. So let's start off with our 2-drops here. In Admiral Piet, we have 2 copies of Admiral Piet. This is one of the cards that we are playing kind of due to us being mono green because we don't have that many options, but he actually works really well in this deck. A 1/4 is a nice defensive body that does trade with a lot of things in the early game if they go to attack it or you maybe attack them. On the other side, if you play it on, let's say, turn 2 or a little bit later, you can give it an experience counter. But if you wait on this guy and you actually play it like turn 4, turn 5, when you've already resupplied, you Super Laser Technician, you commanded, you could actually drop this guy and then potentially drop, let's say, 97 Legion or a Reinforcement Walker, which is an absurd combo and can immediately bring you back into the game, especially something like Reinforcement Walker, where you get to heal 6 health with Admiral Piet plus Reinforcement Walker. That is something you want to keep in mind. Don't just always slam this guy in the early game. You might want to consider keeping him because you will have the mana to potentially drop a Piet and a Reinforcement Walker in the same turn sometimes in this deck with all the ramp that you're playing. 3 copies of Seasoned Shore Trooper here. This is one of the best 2-drops in green for villainy, to be honest. And getting 6 resources to make it a 4/3 is quite easy in this deck. Pretty standard stuff. 3 copies of Colonel Yularen. This one's really important because it's a 2/3 on turn 1 that can heal a damage immediately, which can come into play. Let's say you pass. Let's say you don't care about initiative too much on the earlier turns. You want to say pass, 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 and then maybe they play a Sabine or something. That could happen. Of course, you could just run this out and then follow it up with things like Super Laser Technician or Seasoned Shore Trooper, put an experience counter on Seasoned Shore Trooper. Whatever it is, we're playing all green with the exception of 1 card in the ground units and, well, 3 cards in the space units that are going to heal us a ton of additional health. This is really important against the aggro decks. This is the 2-drop that you want to see the most, and it's oftentimes the 2-drop that they're going to want to kill immediately. So you might want to consider playing this on turn 2, where you go Yularen, give an experience counter. Now it's a 3/4, and they've probably already hit you, which means that you get to heal a bit damage. We have 3 copies of Super Laser Technician. I don't think this guy needs too much of an explanation, but a 2/1 that's gets defeated all the time, potentially heals you with Yularen and ramps you. Keep in mind that if you do go ahead and ECL this guy out, you could go ahead and play this on turn 2, ECL him out, maybe trade with something, give an experience token to one of your 2-drops that you played. So a very powerful turn. If you go turn 1, Seasoned Shore Trooper, turn 2, Super Laser, ECL, kill their Viper Probe Droid or whatever it is, give an experience count to Seasoned Shore Trooper. Now you have an extra resource, which means your target's going to come down next turn, and you have a Seasoned Shore Trooper that has an experience counter on it. Do not underestimate how much value you can get from Tarkin's abilities. One of the reasons why I like Tarkin so much. Emperor's Royal Guard, 3-drop. That is a 3/4, not a 3/5, but it's a 3/4 with Sentinel a lot of the time, okay? When this guy comes down, you might have a Yularen or Pia already down, but if you don't, Tarkin himself is an official unit, so that does give you Sentinel. This guy oftentimes is just a solid body. We also have 1 copy of Cell Block Guard. I don't want to play too many copies of this guy in the main deck. Again, he doesn't synergize with Yularen, which is one of the big things that I am considering, but another Sentinel is totally great, especially against those, well, more aggro-y decks. While Yularen is great against aggro decks, sometimes you just need a Sentinel, and that's where that guy comes in. 2 copies of Grand Moff Tarkin here. This one is more of a value play. He is particularly good against the more grindy strategies / more controlling decks, getting you 2 Imperial cards when you're playing 9 different sources of ramp can be very, very powerful. We have 3 copies of Steadfast Battalion. Now, while we are more of a rampy / value-y mid-range deck, Steadfast Battalion is still absurd if you ECL it, right? It's going to be a 7/7 on ECL, which will come down the same turn that Tarkin can come down. And you could also, if you super laser out something or resupply on turn 2, this is coming down on turn 3 with your leader. Okay, this is really a really powerful turn. Heck, if you go turn 1 Seasoned Shore Trooper, turn 2 ECL super laser out, kill something, give an experience counter to Shore Trooper. You could even just play a Steadfast Battalion on top of Tarkin in that turn, get another experience counter. The next turn, your Steadfast Battalion is going to be really absurd. 2 copies of Rook. He is an Imperial, which a lot of people forget about, which is pretty cool. Also, him with an experience counter is really absurd because guess what? You could just keep putting experience counters on the same unit. But him just defeating anything, except for, of course, leader units, is really just super powerful. And if you can keep them alive, you get extra value. Also, another really good target to ECL out. If, let's say, they go with ECL Steadfast Battalion or something like that, and then you ECL your Rook into their Steadfast Battalion, you can mitigate all that damage because it's shielded, and you can prevent, their Steadfast Battalion attack potentially. Or maybe you just ECL something else. Heck, they maybe play, I don't know, Darth Vader and 97th Legion Reinforcement Walker. You can just kill anything, guys, or you just play it for value. Then we have a 97th Legion, also another Imperial. This is just a nice value play for later on in the game. This is one of those cards that can be ambushed out with Admiral Piet. And once again, because we're running a lot of ramp sources, this guy's just going to be, well, minimum 7/7/7, which is nice, or maybe a 7 mana or 7 resource 8/8, 9/9, 10/10, which oftentimes happens. 3 copies of Darth Vader. Now, this is what I want to talk a little bit more because this is the most expensive card in the deck. If you were to look at all the different cards, for the most part, this deck isn't too bad. And most of the time, villainy cards or villainy decks aren't too bad if you don't run Darth Vader. Darth Vader, very powerful. One of the ways that you can swing back into a game against aggro decks, if you ramp a little bit and then you Darth Vader and you hit, let's say, Cell Block Guard or a Royal Guard, and you have a Tarkin out. Now you have a Sentinel, you've ambushed a creature, and you go ahead and still have a 4, 5/3 left over. Vader is really good. And if you don't run Vader, this deck gets a lot weaker, as with any deck. But if you don't want to run Vader, which is totally reasonable because he's like $80, so it's $240 just for this card specifically, you could go ahead and run things like an extra copy of 97th Legion, an extra copy of Rook, or you can take out Darth Vader and put in some things from the sideboard and potentially run in another ambush card, which we'll talk about a little bit later. Something to consider. I would just finish off playsets on the earlier portions of the curve, specifically Rook and 97th Legion, to give you kind of another couple of cards that are a little bit more high end. And you could also run potentially like, well, a couple more green higher drops that exist in the game. Darth Vader is definitely one of the better ones, but I totally understand if you don't want to get Darth Vaders. I don't even have a playset in paper. I borrow Darth Vaders or I just play online. 3 copies of a Reinforcement Walker is going to finish off the ground units. This guy is arguably the most important unit on this top end, even more important than Vader. If you've not played with Reinforcement Walker, you do not know the power of this guy. He works with Admiral Piet. If you do ambush this guy out, it is absurd. But one of the best ways to kind of seal the deal in more damage-oriented matchups, let's say Boba's gotten an early lead, they've tempoed you out a little bit, but you finally get to that 8 mana and you drop a Reinforcement Walker. Let's say you don't even have Piet. It just heals 3. And then you can immediately attack, kill a unit, heal another 3. They have to deal with this. Unfortunately, Boba is one of the decks that can deal with a little bit better with exhausts and waylays. If you're against something like a Sabine or a Leia, allowing you to ramp Reinforcement Walker is really, really good. And while the ramp is a little bit sketchy because, well, do you really want to be ramping and taking a turn off while the characters or opponents are beating you down? Well, some of our ramp actually is removal as well, which is pretty interesting. So does work quite well, and Reinforcement Walker is one of the best cards in green, to be honest. It is an absurd card. Definitely one of our best payoffs. It is not an Imperial, which is something to remember. Both Steadfast Battalion and Reinforcement Walker is not an Imperial, so you cannot put experience counters on them, just so you remember. With that said, let's hop over to our space units. All right, so this is one of the other downsides to being mono green, is that we really don't get access to a ton of great space units, and we really have to rely on either healing our own base or potentially other removal spells that we have. However, the ones that we do have here are very strong. First one up, you have 3 copies of the TIE Fighter. This is really good in this deck because on turn 1, you could play this and then give it an experience counter, and boom, it is a 3/2 flyer on turn 1, which trades with basically anything. We have 3 copies of Consortium Star Viper, not an Imperial, but also very powerful. This card in particular is one of the most unassuming cards in the deck, but is one of the most important cards in the deck because it has Restore 2 when you have the initiative, but also because if you're fighting the more aggro matchups, if you're fighting like Boba, for example, oftentimes they don't have an insane amount of space units that you have to deal with, but if you're fighting the aggro, oftentimes they do, and they are very high pressure. And so this is one of those units where I ECL out more often than you might expect, right? Turn 1, I play a unit. Turn 2 or turn 3, I am ECLing out a Star Viper. Why? Because I just need to deal with one of their space units before they attack. And oftentimes it's like an A-wing or an X-wing, so my guy lives. And if you take the initiative, guess what? That's also restoring 2. You could also potentially go for a double spell turn where you ramp on turn 2. Turn 3, you might play a Consortium Star Viper and something else, which could be really nice. But this guy is very, very good. Our final space unit is one of the best top-end units in the game. Devastator. We got 2 copies of Devastator, 10/10 Sentinel, with the ability to go ahead and just nug something, just hit it for 10 when it comes into play. This is one of the ways that we can compete with things like Fett's Fire Spray, because eventually we just kind of lose to that card if we don't have a way to really deal with it. But if you do happen to be able to live, or maybe you kind of killed off some units and you're just ramping and you're slowly getting resources, you're able to hold on, and then boom, you drop a Devastator, knock out their Fett's Fire Spray. And that's something that they really can't deal with, because if they waylay it, for example, you're just playing it again and killing something else, which is really, really cool. So Devastator, one of the best top end cards, along with Reinforcement Walker in the deck. With that said, let's hop over to the events and upgrades. So starting us off, we have 3 copies of Resupply. This is pretty straightforward. Turn 2, you play a Resupply, and then you can follow it up with Tarkin's action on one of your 2 drops. Pretty strong. This is just a way to get to an earlier Tarkin or earlier 5 drop. Just a very, very powerful card. Keep in mind that if you draw this later in the game and you're like, oh, I don't really need another resource, so I'll just go ahead, or I don't want to resource something, whatever it is, you can just resource the Resupply. Like, why keep a Resupply in the later parts of the game when it's just going to give you a resource when you could just resource it? But you may want to keep Resupply because you may want to go ahead and Resupply and resource to even ramp further up to your 10 drops, which we do have a couple of them. Next up, we have 2 copies of Maximum Firepower. This is another way to get some removal in the deck. As I mentioned, if we don't have a ton of space units, we need to be able to deal with the space units. Now, Maximum Firepower is really, really powerful when we're ramping with Tarkin. You can very much get 2 Imperial units on the battlefield, especially since those Imperial units are going to get experience tokens. So you're oftentimes going to be able to deal, at minimum, like 3 to 4 damage. Oftentimes, that's what I find. But there are a lot of times where this is going to deal like 8 or 9 because you have 2 Imperial units to hit with. Then we have the kind of reason why I wanted to build mono green Tarkin in command. Now, this card is an absurd card. It is it's a maximum firepower that also is a resupply. Now, keep in mind that the 2 most commonly used modes are going to be friendly unit deals damage equal to its power to a non-unique enemy unit, and put this event into play as a resource. But that doesn't mean that you don't want to give experience counters or returning a unit from your discard pile. Giving 2 experience tokens to a Tarkin, for example, is really powerful. And you could, of course, follow that up by dealing the damage to a non-unique enemy unit, giving them 2 additional power. So instead of, let's say, dealing 2 with Tarkin, you deal 4 now. It is also important to note that this doesn't kill everything. Let's just say I was fighting this deck and I was, going to use command to try to kill stuff. Okay. Steadfast Battalion gets killed, Seasoned Sword Trooper gets killed, Super Laser Technician gets killed, Royal Guard, Cell Block Guard, Reinforcement Walker gets killed by it. The Star Viper gets killed, the TIE Fighter gets killed, but Tarkin, Piet, Yularen, Rook, 97th Legion, Darth Vader do not get killed because you cannot target unique enemy units with this spell. So just keep that in mind. If you're fighting something like Boba, it doesn't hit, the Bobas or Fett's Fire Spray, but it will hit things like Cartel Spacer. It'll hit things like the 3-2 shielded unit. It'll hit a lot of things, but it doesn't hit everything. So just keep that in mind. 3 copies of Overwhelming Barrage. We are going to have units on the battlefield, and if you're ramping into things like Steadfast Battalion, you could do things like ramp into Steadfast Battalion, ECL something out, and then you can even potentially attack with Steadfast Battalion again, pump something up, and then Overwhelming Barrage. Or you can just give an experience token to something like a Seasoned Shore Trooper. Again, turn 1, Seasoned Shore Trooper. Turn 2, Super Laser ECL. Turn 3, after you've given an experience token to Seasoned Shore Trooper, you can OB for 5 damage off of your Seasoned Shore Trooper. That's really strong. You just have a lot of units to be able to Overwhelming Barrage with. It works particularly well with 97th Legion, as that's a very, very, strong unit, as well as Steadfast Battalion as well, if you're able to get an attack with it. And of course, if you don't have anything to use it with, you can just drop a Tarkin and hit something for 4. That's oftentimes good enough as well. Lastly, we have 1 copy of Traitorous. Now, this is something that I found to be particularly good. It's really good against something like Boba Fett, as you can just take it and then hopefully kill that Boba Fett. So, the 3-5 Boba Fett, that is. Because what they're going to want to do is they're going to want to waylay the Boba Fett back to their hand and remove the Traitorous, potentially. But if you're able to go ahead and Boba Fett attack an exhausted enemy unit, let's say they go, I don't know, Crafty Smuggler into Boba Fett into, turn 3, they're going to try to play something else, and you Traitorous their Boba Fett, you attack their Crafty Smuggler, you could potentially removal spell that guy, as well as, if they decide to waylay it, well, you kind of used up their turn and removed their board, and that's all you really need to do against Boba, is just to stall into the later parts of the game, where you're going to outpower them with things like Devastator, Reinforcement Walkers, commands, and things like that. So just keep that in mind. It's also really good against something like a Sabine, or something like a Echo-based Defender, or whatever it is, Red 3 even, anything, removal with the addition of being able to do a double removal spell, because you could kill one of their own creatures with their own creatures, is really, really powerful. That's going to be the main deck. I will give you all kind of some final thoughts before we dive into the sideboard. As I mentioned, this is definitely a little bit more spicy because it is mono green. The mono color decks are a little bit harder to kind of get to work. So it's not going to be absolutely amazing. I don't think it's nearly as strong as like Red Leia, for example, but it is good. And I would definitely slot it into kind of like that tier 2 position after your tier 1 decks, which include things like Boba, Red Leia. You could even put Sabine in there, Iden, Krennic, and then you have things like Grand Inquisitor, mono green Tarkin, that type of stuff is kind of where I would put it. But with that said, let's drop over to the sideboard. All right, so this is where we shore up some of the weaknesses of the deck in certain matchups. 2 copies of Cell Block Guard to start us off. This is particularly good against some of the more aggro matchups if they don't have, or even if we don't have a green pip in the Cell Block Guard, and so we can't heal off Yularen, the Sentinel is extremely important. It basically trades with everything that they have. So if they're hitting it with Sabine, a Battlefield Marine, a Echo-based Defender, basically anything that they can play on turn 1 or on turn 2 for the most part, it is going to trade with. And you really want to get things like Tarkin out of your deck, because you don't really want to be drawing additional cards, and some of the most expensive stuff can be a little bit mediocre. We do have 1 additional copy of Tarkin. This one's particularly good against the more controlling matchups where you're kind of just grinding out. You both have things like Reinforcement Walkers, and you want to get to the more expensive cards, or just get some additional value so you can ramp and have the card draw to back it up so you can outpower your opponents. This is where the deck really shines, in my opinion, is when you're fighting the more controlling matchups. It is a very, very good kind of deck against the Idens and the Krennics. 3 copies of Escort Skiff. This is another unit that I like to slot in against Boba and against aggro. It really comes down and hits very, very hard. It can smack things and kind of eliminate certain units that they may not be expecting, right? If you come down and you play this and you kill like their Battlefield Marine or their Sabine or whatever they decided to play. Heck, you could even kill a K2SO or trade with a K2SO if you want, because you're basically always going to have another green unit. Also, if you look, Tarkin is green, so you can oftentimes play this guy. Same turn Tarkin comes down, so you guarantee have a green unit. That's something to keep in mind. Next up, we have 1 copy of Rook. This really comes in against Boba Fett. I find him to be very, very strong against Boba Fett in particular, because it's just going to kind of kill off some of the units that are really problematic. Things like Bosk, things like, other Boba Fett, mini Boba Fett, things like that. 1 copy of Relentless. This is to side in against some of the more controlling matchups. And it's just a very, very strong, 8/8 for 9 that kind of gives you just that huge edge, because they cannot play the things like, take down or vanquish or whatever they're trying to play. It just doesn't work, which is really powerful when you get to a later game. 1 more copy of Traitorous. Again, I very much like this against the Boba matchup. All you need to do is stall them. That's all you need to do. Boba is much more of a mid-range tempo deck, and so if you get to the later parts of the game, you will outpower them, and that is what Traitorous is trying to do. It's also very good against the aggro matchup. And 1 more copy of Maximum Firepower if you're having trouble dealing with some of the more flyers in the format, or if there's just a really problematic permanent that you really have to deal with, or you find that it's really constantly messing you up. Things like potentially a Reinforcement Walker, or things like maybe a Fett's Fire Spray. I do like another Maximum Firepower against that. That can come in. Is this going to be the absolute best deck to fight everything? No. It is, as I mentioned, not in the top levels of the meta, but it is very fun, and it does have a really good matchup against control. That is where this deck really does shine. Of course, one of the best ways to kind of beat control, especially since they don't have counter spells, is just to ramp past them and get down your big stuff before they get down their big stuff, right? If you're fighting like Iden Green or Krennic Green and they're trying to Death Trooper you, what are they going to kill with Death Trooper? Nothing. Death Trooper is pretty bad against this deck, right? Or they're trying to take down or vanquish. If they're going for resource, take down your Emperor's Royal Guard or whatever, I'm very happy with that. So that's where the deck really shines. And of course, you are able to compete at least somewhat reasonably against, the more aggro decks or even the Boba decks. Although Boba is the hardest matchup for sure, as with any deck, which is why I talk about it a lot, but it is still solid. And I've been really having a ton of fun. Let me know what you all think about the monocolored cards. This is the reason why I built this deck in particular, and I've been trying to build more monocolored cards or monocolored decks, because I love the command, the vigilance, the cunning, and all that stuff. Of course, the one exception to, having a hard time building around is mono yellow Boba, which is just really good because Boba's really good. So that one's less exciting because everyone, can go ahead and play that as sort of the meta, but vigilance, command, and aggression, those types of cards are a lot harder to make use out of. So let me know what you think. Thanks for watching, everyone. And if you enjoyed, be sure to subscribe, and I'll see you all tomorrow for either the Cheer It list or the yellow Leia, and I think I have a mono red Sabine in the making, which is pretty fun as well. So see you then.